Is America going to survive if we become increasingly secular? Can this nation continue to exist without God, without morality? And to what degree are your freedoms and your liberties tied to moral knowledge? Stay tuned on this edition of Truth for a New Generation. We're going to talk about the connection between your freedoms and belief in God, the Equality Act, and how pending legislation threatens the very survival of the country. Can America exist as a secular country with growing numbers of young people professing to not believe in God and to be agnostic? What does that mean for the future of the country? Hi, Alex McFarland here. We have a very important show today on Truth for a New Generation. And in a few moments, we've got a guest, a colleague of many years, Ann Paulk of the Restored Hope Network. And predominantly, she is known for her testimony of coming out of lesbianism and for building a coalition of great thinkers and scholars who talk about human sexuality and the current culture. But I want to talk about the spiritual DNA of the country and how it relates to our liberties and freedoms. You know, this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about because I feel like it is such an important subject. And I'll begin with a story from 1937. There was a Democrat congressman from New York State named Saul Bloom, S-O-L, Saul Bloom. And on the 150th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution, he wrote a book about the history of the Constitution. Now, I love what Saul Bloom wrote for a lot of reasons, because it relates to the question of, can America exist as a completely secular nation? Because when you talk about God and morals and the influence of the church, talk about Christianity, and the framers had a biblical worldview, very often people will be dismissive and say, well, you're a right-wing conservative evangelical Christian, and not everybody believes like you. And so this idea that America's freedoms and really the DNA of what our culture is about is contingent on God, that's just some of the talking points of the hyper-conservative Republican evangelicals, many assume. But let's go back to Saul Bloom, because he was not an evangelical Christian, and he was not a conservative as we would define it today, although I would say as a Democrat in 1937, Saul Bloom was probably more conservative than many of the Rhino Republicans today. But he wrote this book called The Story of the Constitution. Now, decades later, long after Saul Bloom's death, his book, The Story of the Constitution, was called by an Illinois university, quote, a classic in constitutional studies. In other words, and he talks about the biblical worldview that the framers had. Now, he was asked in his day, in the 1930s, could or should an atheist ever be the president of the United States? I get asked this. When I was, for a number of years, debating representatives from American atheists, they were very prominent about a decade ago, and they've kind of fizzled a little bit in their cultural influence, which is good. But a number of people from American atheists used to say to me that we will not rest until there is a vocal atheist in the White House. But Saul Bloom said this about, could America be led by a president who is an atheist? Should America be godless rather than godly? And here's what he said, quote, I maintain that the spirit of the Constitution forbids it. The Constitution prescribes an oath of affirmation, said Saul Bloom. That is, in essence, a covenant with the people, which the president pledges himself to keep with the help of Almighty God, end of quote. Now, a covenant, that's a biblical word. Do you know the word covenant means to cut something? It really means to cut a cut. Sounds redundant, doesn't it? When God and Abraham made the covenant back in Genesis chapter 12, and God didn't have to promise anything to Abraham, but he did. The Bible says that God could not swear by anyone greater than himself because he is God. But what they did, they would cut the pieces of a bird and walk between the pieces. And the word covenant means, may this be what happens to me if I don't fulfill my part of the bargain. Even Saul Bloom said, we're a nation contingent on belief in God because elected officials pledge to God for help in fulfilling the promises they make to the citizens. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk more about the relationship between God, morals, your freedom, and your future. Stay tuned to Truth for a New Generation.
Man, before I came to Charis, I was so broken.
I dealt a lot with anxiety and depression.
I didn't really realize I could have an actual relationship with God.
When I came here, I started to see God like, he just wants to have a relationship with me. It totally transformed the way I look at God.
God longs to have fellowship with you.
This is where faith comes from. It's not just head knowledge, Bible school knowledge, it's revelation knowledge that changes you.
Just been set free from a lot of the bondage I was in.
I haven't been depressed in so long.
Pretty awesome having that just weight lifted and putting on Jesus' yoke.
You come here and you meet God personally, and then he gives you a whole new direction.
This is a time, this is a season of your life that God's wanting to show you who you really are and what he's wanting to do in your life.
If you have a desire for Bible college, God's the one that put it there.
If you're considering coming to Charis, I just want to say it's going to be one of the best decisions you've made in your life.
Welcome back to Truth for a New Generation. Alex McFarland here. Hey, along the course of life in ministry, you meet a lot of people, and as may be expected, some make more of an impression than others. And certainly one of the most impressive leaders that I've had the privilege of knowing for quite a number of years is Ann Paulk. She's the founder of the Restored Hope Network, and she is a person that I want to really get her take on the Equality Act and just some of the trends in our culture related to the erosion of morals. There's a lot we can talk about, but she is a beloved colleague and friend and really on the cutting edge of some issues that impact our future, and I would say really the survival or lack thereof of America. And so, Ann, I want to thank you for being on Truth for a New Generation. And
what a delight to join you.
Kudos for getting up early. I know you're in Mountain Time, we're East Coast time, and you got up really early to film this, and I want to say thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
For those that may not know, tell us about the Restored Hope Network and what your ministry does.
You bet. We are a coalition of ministries, pastors, and counselors across the U.S. who help people who want to leave homosexuality or transgenderism, and also their families, families who are impacted by a loved one who's identified as LGBT, just encouraging, supporting, and strengthening them.
And I know on your board of advisors and trustees, you've got some of my colleagues and friends like Dr. Michael Brown. I know some years ago when I personally asked James Dobson to write an endorsement for your ministry, which he doesn't do that often. In fact, almost never does he put his name on another ministry. But when he learned about what Restored Hope does and that it's led by you, he right away said, I'm on board. So you have the endorsement of a lot of very respected individuals, don't you?
We do, and we're so grateful. We are thrilled to be a Christian coalition and enjoy the support of many, including Dr. Dobson, Al Mohler, Dr. Brown, yourself, Janet Parshall, and many others. I'm just grateful.
Yeah, well, you and I were talking a day or so ago about the Equality Act, and one of my core subjects is about the moral foundation that the founders had in view when our Constitution was written. And really, I belief in the Judeo-Christian moral foundation, which sometimes is called natural law. That was one of the genius parts of what the founders envisioned. You and I know that's under attack and all but lost. I want to talk about two things: the Equality Act, but also why morality is a core of our nation and really any civilized culture. First of all, the Equality Act. What is it? Why is it important?
You know, the Equality Act has a great sounding name. Who doesn't want rights and respect for individuals of any background? That's not what is in the bullseye here, though. In fact, it seems to have been written to overturn most of the wins in the pro-life legislation and wins in the Supreme Court for pro-life legislation, including any situations where religious liberty comes in conflict with LGBT ideology. That's where it appears that they're seeking to overturn most all of those things. From the cake baker in Colorado, where I am, Jack Phillips, to the florist in Washington State, to any number of things, and including employment, banking, et cetera. I mean, accommodations in this particular bill includes any service of any kind that's offered to the public. And so we want the public coming to church, don't we? And so all of a sudden, a whole bunch of things become impacted by this bill that would put transgender ideology into law and make it a step above any other liberty or rights of other individuals. And so that's an unfortunate appearing to be the goal of it. So it is really troubling. It's even troubling within the LGBT communities. In the UK right now, there are situations where dating websites for lesbians are being infiltrated by biological men who dress as women and want to date women. And they cannot say no to these individuals because of they're called transphobic and everything else. And so it's actually going quite a bit further than you'd ever guess.
You know, G.K. Chesterton said, man can either be governed by the 10 commandments or he will have to be controlled by the 10,000 commandments. Now, the reason I bring that quote up is, as we've abandoned basic morality, and now as behaviors are treated as an ethnicity. I mean, when I was in grad school earning a degree in developmental psych, homosexual activity was treated as a behavior. Gender confusion was treated as a perspective or a behavior. But now homosexual activity and transgender ideation is treated as an ethnicity. And that's required throwing out any kind of moral foundation. Thus, like with the website you referenced, there's got to be all these caveats to really ameliorate the situations created by our abandonment of morality. I guess that's a long way of saying we're kind of lost at sea, aren't we?
We really are. We are, and so much so that this new group of individuals who are pushing this kind of legislation believe that they're on the moral high ground. They really use moral language. And if you listen well, you'll hear that people who disagree with them are considered immoral or hateful or bigoted or racist. It's a fascinating change of events. And that says to us that the younger generations have really been persuaded by LGBTQ ideology in schools. They've been targeted to change the perspective. I don't know if you're aware, I'm sure you are aware, Alex, but in 1990s, late 1980s, a book came out called After the Ball, and it was a strategy book and a marketing book for how homosexual identified people would change the perspective of Americans on this topic. And they've been enormously successful. They're very targeted points, which are marketing and also psychological warfare points, have worked very effectively to demonize anyone who opposes their point of view.
You know, so many pastors, Ann, really won't speak to this issue. They're completely uninformed about the Equality Act or wouldn't have the courage to speak about it. Here's my point, though. The Christian gospel says that God loves you, Christ died for you, but it does say repent In other words, turn from sin to Christ. Would the Equality Act basically make it illegal to say, look, hey, I love you, but that is sin, and if you don't turn from it, it will destroy you? I mean, would legislation like this just further incapacitate the church from really sharing the gospel message?
Yes, in fact, we're seeing that just across the border north of us. They've actually talked about behavioral change or attitude or identity change in the bills and named organizations that help people with those topics across just north of us in Canada. And not only that, but the UN researcher or journalist, reporter, is focused on that as well. In fact, he's even suggested that if someone mentions that homosexuality is transgressive, that's his language for using sin, the word sin, that they should be given reparations. As a result of that, there should be criminal impact. And just across the border, it's considered 10 years in prison for preaching about homosexuality and multiple thousands of dollars in fines. So people are stepping back from that, realizing this is dangerous. Just counseling someone who comes to our office saying they want to leave homosexuality and then becomes offended or changes their mind later could end up putting a pastor in prison. And that actually is pretty offensive. So if we don't speak up now, we're in great trouble as a nation. Our perspective and morality, the church is an incredible tool to get across messages. And if she caves on these things, all that's left is the world's message that homosexuality is ideal. It's as significant and more important than religious freedom.
The anti-sodomy laws of the early American states, as from what I read, were rarely, almost never enforced. So within the gay movement from the 60s up through the present day, do you think any of the people that wanted affirmation and wanted not just tolerance, but affirmation, do you think they realized they would set in motion the falling of dominoes that really would undermine the structure of society and government?
Well, I think some did. I think the people who were part of the Stonewall movement and then shortly thereafter, the Mattachine Society, which is a communist-based group that was very much for gay and lesbian rights. It was a very, very minor number of people, a very tiny percentage of gay people. I don't believe that most gay identified people would have wanted to set this particular aspect in motion. In fact, some in the UK right now are pushing back against what is the outcome of all of this. A lot of people who are pro-LGBT rights are also speaking out about the Equality Act, including Abigail Shrier, who's a editor at Wall Street Journal, right? She came out with this book, Irreversible Damage, and about the transgender craze that's hitting our teen girls and how to put a halt to that. She was not the first person who identified this. It was actually Lisa Littman at Brown University, who found thousands of parents who were saying, my daughter, who was very successfully identified and very close in our family to her parents, is now identifying as a trans or a male instead. And now we're gripped with this ideological strong arm technique of, if you don't let me go this direction, mom or dad, I will commit suicide. And they're taught this on social media by trans activists. So tiny numbers of people can accomplish this massive outcome of what's become a craze amongst teen girls of rebellion. And it's ultimately damaging. It's so troubling to me, Alex, that healthy individuals, physically healthy body parts of individuals are being removed simply because of this ideological persuasion. They're left with sterilization. They're left with the outcome. Yeah, puberty blockers mixed with cross-sex hormones creates sterility. And so we're talking about teenagers making decisions for the rest of their lives.
And I interviewed an oncology nurse at a hospital, a major hospital. She works with cancer patients, many of whom were transitioning and with just hyper strong doses of estrogen or testosterone. And this nurse said, and I quote, to transition and subject yourself to hormone replacement therapy is to give yourself cancer. And she listed 17 types of cancers. But we're running short on time. You have a conference coming up, a very important conference. Tell people about that, if you would. We've only got about a minute. And give your website, too.
We do have a wonderful conference coming up. It is Hope 2021. It will be June 11th and 12th, Mountain Standard Time, 9 to 3. Online, so anyone can join us from anywhere. We'll be covering topics like transgender medicine, and Dr. Nancy Haish will be a keynote speaker, Andrew Kamitsky, and of course, Alex McFarland, which I'm really thrilled to have you, sir, join us and share worldview and apologetics with our listeners. I'm grateful for that. It's really organized for people struggling with LGBT topics, family members, counselors, lay people, counselors, pastors is what I meant to say. And the website is restoredhopenetwork.org. Just go up to events and you'll find it right there. restoredhopenetwork.org. I want to encourage people to check out that website, even if you don't agree with Ann's or my position on biblical morality. Check it out. Ann, thanks for being with us on Truth for a New Generation. Thank you, Alex.
We'll be back after this.
I just returned from a conference at the Cove, and it was absolutely breathtaking in every way. The mountain views, the tranquil areas within the woods, and just being alone with God. Mornings spent watching the sunrise from a rocking chair with coffee in one hand and my Bible in the other. Evenings spent reflecting on the incredible spiritual teaching. It's the embodiment of peacefulness. Come and experience the Cove for yourself.
You can't have liberty without morality, and you really don't have morality without God. You know, we're living in a time when so many things that run counter to our moral conscience are being not only tolerated, talked about, but really almost imposed, enforced on the American people. Now, psychologists tell us that people cannot forever live in a state of cognitive dissonance. If you have two things in your mind that are incompatible and absolutely contradictory to each other, you will in some way try to reconcile these things. People walk around for years and they know something is wrong, but they try to act like everything is all right. And you'll at best maybe get a stomach ulcer. And if you don't deal with things in your life and in your mind that are contradictory and incompatible, well, it can really take an emotional toll. Now, in our nation, I've said it so many times on the programs, the country was based on the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the Judeo-Christian moral code. You know, William Rehnquist, who was a Supreme Court justice in the 1980s, he was commenting one time on that very famous court decision in the 1940s, Emerson versus the state of New Jersey, where sadly it was invoked a letter that Thomas Jefferson had written where he said there was a wall of separation between church and state. But you've got to understand how the Emerson court decision and many people in the decades since have really taken it 180 degrees out of phase, because the Baptist preacher that founded Rhode Island, whose statue is in the Capitol, Roger Williams, he said, in America, the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the Egypt of the world, God hath forever broken down. In other words, the church and the people of God, that's like the Garden of Eden. The lost secular world without God, that's like Egypt. And Roger Williams had once famously said that in America, the uniting of the principles of good civil government with biblical principles, the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the Egypt of the world God hath forever broken down. Now, Jefferson had quoted that, but in the Emerson versus the state of New Jersey case 70-some years ago, the Supreme Court said there was, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, which is completely the opposite of what that phrase was intended originally. Now, William Rehnquist of the Supreme Court 30 years ago, he said that Emerson is useless for understanding the Constitution. Where are we today? We are trying to, in our mind, legitimize abortion, legitimize gay marriage, legitimize transgenderism as an ethnicity. We know it's wrong. It is counter to reality. But friend, our inability to stand for truth jeopardizes the Constitution. Please be willing to stand strong for truth.
My beliefs aren't exactly popular.
You can tell me I'm on the wrong side of history all you want, but you won't change my mind.
That's because I'm standing on something that doesn't change.
Therefore, let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering.
For he who promised is faithful.
As Christians, it's important to remember that no matter how good or bad things may seem, nothing changes our King or our call.
Are you listening to the I Hear You podcast? You're not listening? You've not subscribed yet? Well, you need to do this today. My podcast that I do very regularly with my friend Odell Cleveland. Hey, listen, there's nothing like it out there. Odell and I talk about race. We talk about politics. We talk about culture. And you can find this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and digital content. I Hear Ya, and that's Y-A, ihearya.show. And listen, subscribe, get your I Hear You dog tags and coffee mug, and be willing to talk with people different than you and make those friendships and arrive at truth together. And the I Hear You podcast, I think, will be a great blessing in your life. But I want to say thanks for all the people that financially support Truth for a New Generation and Alex McFarland Ministries. The gospel is being proclaimed, lives are being impacted, our nation is being restored, and you're part of it. And your financial support is being used very effectively. Now, for your gift of at least $50, I'm going to send you 2 books. One is called The God You Thought You Knew, Exposing 10 Common Myths About Christianity. I wrote it for millennials. It's a powerful book on the Christian faith and how to defend what you believe. The other book I'm going to send you is 10 Answers for Skeptics. I sat down face to face with 32 atheists. We respond to their objections. These are yours for a gift of at least $50. If you make it at least $75, we'll include the Great Apologetics t-shirt. You're going to love it. And so I want to thank you for your prayers, your tax-deductible financial gifts. I want to encourage you, stand strong for truth and stay tuned to Truth for a New Generation.